We are going to be celebrating our 175th anniversary next year at Toledo Public Schools. We are the second longest entity still in existence in the city of Toledo after the Toledo Blade, so that's a pretty major accomplishment for us. So next year, in lieu of lectures, we'll actually be giving tours of our historical buildings, Scott, Waite, Harvard, Edgewater, Navarre, so look for that to be coming next year. So tonight, you are ready for a very special treat. Larry Meigs is a dear friend of mine, and this is where I tell a funny joke, but our spectrum is so high that I'm not going to do that.
Well, I just changed now, or I'll do the funny joke.
Okay, all right, then I'll keep my integrity.
Yeah, right.
Mary truly has been a mentor to me. I am not native to Toledo. I've learned everything I know about the history of Toledo through my activities in different organizations. And Larry was the first person who I really reached out to when I was at Navarre School. I said, hey, I'd like to learn more about this. In fact, let's write a whole new Navarre. And that's what got my history about the city of Toledo started. So I really give a claim to Larry for being a guiding light in my personal life and my role as an educator and historian. So tonight we're going to, for a very special treat, tomorrow is the 100th anniversary of Navarre Day in the city of Toledo. And probably nobody else knows that, but happy Navarre Day. It's my honor to introduce everyone.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Robin. Gosh. And yeah, well, Robin's been a mentor to me too. And Robin taught at Navarre School for over 20 years and did so much history. And now that she's a doctor, she's still doing a lot of history of the schools and actually has a position doing that. So she's just great. So anyway, I was going to introduce, start with tomorrow's 100th anniversary of Peter Navarre Day, so we'll just jump right in. And let's see. I have to juggle three things. Peter Navarre. I don't see many East Siders here tonight. I know we got a few, but because we've talked about him so much in East Toledo, they've all heard this. So now we wanted to spread it across the river and make everybody more aware of Peter Navarre, and we thought we would do it since the cabin is right up at Toledo Botanical Gardens, and you guys can visit it, and so we want to just spread the word a little more. Well, there he is in life. This photograph's actual photograph, taken in 1868, 6 years before he died. We don't know when he was born, sometime between 1785. He wanted to make himself seem older. So he'll usually say 1785, that's what it says on the cabin. Could be as late as 1790, but here he is, already nearly 80, and they got him all dressed up and took this photograph from life. And he was in the woods his whole life, living his pioneer life. And that's not a signed card there because he couldn't write. We've got one of his documents that he attested to. It just makes an X. But he could speak the languages. He could speak Potawatomi, Miami, Ottawa. He was very intelligent, really. And so that's what he actually looked like with his musket. And he was born in Detroit, grew up in what's now Monroe, Michigan, which was called Frenchtown, and it was all French. And Detroit was too, Detroit, the Narrows. And his grandfather, Robert Navarre, was sent over here by France to make a place here in this area for the people to settle. Because you know the French wanted to cut the colonies off, and the British did too. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So it was a French settlement, and it was called Frenchtown. These buildings still stand in Monroe, Michigan. This is where Peter grew up. These were built in 1789, the oldest wooden buildings left in the state of Michigan. And then in 1807, Peter and his four brothers came down to this area, which is long before it was called Toledo, and settled out on the bay shore road out here as you come out Otter Creek and you come up here to the end of the river. This is called Presque Isle, this little point here. And then here's the Bay Shore area. So Maumee Bay State Park is over in this area. And that was called the Navarre Tract. See, Navarre Tract. They were given that land and settled there. And that's where they made their home, just the 5 brothers. They lived in cabins. They would go and set their, oh, I should mention Otter while we're here. Right up here at the top is the Otter tract. He was the Ottawa chief, Chief Otter. And there you see they had a baseball team called the Otterkeys later on. Unless, I don't think that's Otter himself became a baseball player. But this would be out there on the Bay Shore where the Ottawa Indians settled. They were asked to leave, not just asked, 1838, and they started the mass migrations away. Well, the Navarres were there since 1807. By 1838, the Ottawa are leaving. And some of them stayed behind, the Navarres, the Kellers, those families out there in Bay Shore. They would take them in the winter and care for them because they were so poor, the ones that stayed behind. And of course, Peter was very close to the Native Americans. And then this is about 1930, shows that whole Bay Shore area. You see all the tank farms, Standard Oil, Gulf Oil. And then this little peninsula out here was Presque Isle. And that was this is the area where they lived. And this is now, you can see they're starting to fill in. This is now the Port Authority, and all the big docks out there. But that was Presque Isle. And it was a big amusement park in the 1890s. Have you guys heard of that, Presque Isle? It was the first amusement park here. And so they had just that little peninsula. You could only get there by the boats leaving from downtown, going at the end of the river. They had a Ferris wheel. The Ferris wheel was invented by George Ferris in the 1890s for the Chicago Exposition. Well, here in the 1890s, we already got one in Toledo. You got a guy standing up here on this ball. I mean, it was quite an amusement park for the 1890s. Well, the Navarres lived in cabins, and this was Peter's latest cabin towards the end of his life, built in the 1860s by his son Peter. And it stood out, we'll talk more about this in a minute, out Corduroy Road as you get out close to Maumee Bay State Park, out just past Norden Road. And so all his life, he lived in a cabin. Inside, this is what it looks like inside the cabin that's now at Toledo Botanical. What do you see? See a lot of furs. And that's what they did. They would trap. He set his traps all the way to Fort Wayne. And so they would go through the woods. That's what they do all the time, sleep in the woods, all the way there and check their traps. And they're mainly interested in beaver pelts because that made top hats. And they were so popular back east. So you see a beaver pelt kind of being turned into a top hat. And that was fancy and expensive. And they made a pretty good living in the fur trade. So he was an excellent woodsman. So he spent all his life, he knew all the little trails. Like I say, he could speak the Native American languages. He just knew the woods. He knew all the little trails and where everything was. And so in 1812, actually early 1813, the War of 1812, now the British are coming in and attacking this area. Coming down from Detroit, that's where the British were based. And you know, the British wanted to cut America off at the colonies. And like I was just telling Chip from Channel 24, this area right here in Northwest Ohio is the Gettysburg of the War of 1812. This was the key area. And so Navarre played a key role in the key times, most important times of this area, because America expansion could have been blocked if we had lost this area in the War of 1812. And so Navarre, being such a good woodsman, and he knew all the trails, he knew the Native Americans, and so General William Henry Harrison used him as a scout because Navarre could tell him where all the British troops were. And Navarre could pass through the lines as just a trapper. And so he was very valuable to Harrison. And Navarre played a crucial role in our history. And I was just thinking back, and Robin and I have talked about this, if you kind of name the most important historical figures from Toledo, say, that influenced our history. You know, Fremont, there's Hayes, there's Charles Woodson, there's McPherson and Clyde, Sherwood Anderson. Who in Toledo is there? Could you name one more important than Peter Navarre? That actually was in this area and lived here and influenced our history anymore. Because after the War of 1812, then things just progressed and became industrial, and all of the industrial leaders that were very important, but our history. Who's that? Perry. Oh yeah, Perry, I'll get to Perry, but he's not from here, you know? And he didn't stay either. And it was probably Navarre that took the message to Perry. I'll get to that in just a minute. But at Fort Meigs, Harrison used him as his scout because the British put him under siege, and so Navarre knew where they were and could get messages through and everything for Harrison. Well, here's Fort Meigs, laid out, the reconstructed fort. It's the largest reconstructed War of 1812 fort in the country. And the British were over here, across in Maumee, over here by First Presbyterian about, and they were shooting cannon across the river into the fort. And it was a major siege. And you notice all these mounds there inside the fort? Those would keep the cannonballs from rolling around the fort when it comes over the wall. Cannonball wasn't likely to hit you on the fly, you know, unless you're having a really bad day. They would hit the ground and just all the way across the fort, roll up everything that's there. So even before the reconstruction of the fort, these mounds were all still out there at the fort, and that was just to keep the cannonballs from rolling around. Well, Fort Meigs held out. Early siege, early in 1813, well, about the end of April, and then later on in July. There were two major sieges, and Fort Meigs held out partly kind of by the skin of their teeth. But the British were trying to decoy them out and everything. Well, they held out. And so what Proctor, the British general, did, he up the Maumee, left the Toledo area, went over the Sandusky River, came down and attacked Fort Stephenson in what is now Fremont. And that was, Navarre also had been over there before the battle. There's the story that we don't believe, Robin and I, that he kind of rode through a thunderstorm in the middle of the night and got there just ahead of the British and warned them, and like Paul Revere kind of thing. But he was involved there and knew Harrison very well. Harrison relied on him. And so it was Major Croghan was the head of the battle there at Fort Stephenson. And it's right there in downtown Fremont, where the library is now. Croghan had about 160 soldiers against as many as 1,000 British and Indians. And he had one cannon. If you go to Fremont, you'll see Old Betsy right there on the grounds where the fort was. And it was the only cannon he had. So there was a 2-day battle, August 1st, 1813. Proctor, the British, are firing all these cannonballs into the fort, and Croghan's moving this cannon all around. So the British would think he had more than one cannon. And that didn't really do much damage. But then the next day, August 2nd, the British decided to launch an attack. And pretty much Croghan knew that's what they were going to do. And Croghan just guessed right. There was a ravine kind of at the northwest corner of the fort, which now is Croghan Street. And there's a ravine that kind of funneled him into that corner. And Croghan guessed right, put Old Betsy in the north blockhouse of the fort that fired right down that ditch. And the British and Native Americans, mostly just the British, were right in that fort, and he just right down, just decimated them. And it wasn't cannonballs, it was nails, it was anything they could load in there, and just wiped them out. And all the British officers that were in the battle were killed. Proctor was back with the boats, but it was a devastating defeat. And so that became the first American victory in the War of 1812. There were sieges, and there was over on Lake Champlain and other things. This was the first major victory, right here in Northwest Ohio. Well, then after they lost the land battles, the British retreated back out into Lake Erie. The British always relied on their Navy. And so, and again, here's Navarre going back and forth. We don't know exactly just what he did. Harrison was at different forts, Fort Seneca, but Navarre was involved with this. But out at Put-in Bay, out on Lake Erie, is where the British fleet was, and that's where Perry comes in. Perry was just a young man too. Croghan was 21. Perry was in his 20s. Perry only lived into his early 30s. But Perry got this American fleet together over in what's now Erie, Pennsylvania, and took it out into the lake and then engaged the British fleet. Now, the Battle of Fort Stephenson was August 1st and 2nd. Fort Meigs was earlier in the year. September 10th was the Battle of Lake Erie, all 1813. Well, it's if you've read about the Battle of Lake Erie, you guys know what happened out there? I know you do, Barb. And, so I guess I won't go into it, but since Barb knows. But what Perry did is, there's Perry, just a young man, Oliver Hazard Perry, and he had two large flagships. The one was the Lawrence, named after his kind of hero, Commander Lawrence, and the Lawrence was pretty much shot out of the water. The masts were leveled off. The decks were just running with blood, largely from the animals they had on there. Cannons were all put out of service. And so Perry gets into one of the rowboats, lifeboats, and he's rowed under the British ships with every cannon trained on him. Didn't have sense enough to sit down. Yeah, that's what he thought he was, crossing the Delaware. But you see the guy pulling on his coat, and it just miraculously got across there into his second ship called the Niagara. And then once he got in the Niagara, the wind shifted, and it was all dependent on wind, because you can only fire the cannons out of the sides. And he sailed right through the center of the British fleet, cannons firing, and within 30 minutes, Barclay was the commander, surrendered the whole fleet. Well, it was like 6 boats. But it was the first time in British naval history, all those centuries, the British ever surrendered a fleet. It's right out here on Lake Erie. And that's, I would say also, and people can argue, but they're wrong. I would say that the Battle of Lake Erie was probably the most important naval battle in American history. You talk about Farragut running the Mississippi, during the Civil War, or the Monitor and the Merrimack and the Civil War. But what would be more important? A whole British fleet. That's what they depended on. And once they surrendered the naval, the control of the lakes, they had nowhere to go. So they retreated back up into Canada. And it's said that Navarre, and we can't prove it, I don't know, but that Navarre is the one that carried the famous message back to Harrison after the battle. Does anybody know what Perry wrote? It's a famous quote. Do you know? We have, yes, we have met the enemy and they are ours. And then he lists the boats, you know. And this made Perry just world famous, really. And it's just an amazing story. So there's the Niagara, and it's been rebuilt. There's the masts and everything on these boats they had. There's the Perry Peace Monument out on South Bass, about 320 feet high, third largest monument in America after, what's the Washington, 555? And I don't know, it's the third largest monument in America. And still there. And then in 1913, on the 100th anniversary of the battle, the rebuilt Niagara sailed all around the Great Lakes and, of course, came into Toledo. And by the way, here you see it with the Toledo Trust Tower down there. That was the only skyscraper to the OI building was built in 29. This was built in 1912. It's just a year old. And there's Wilcox and all these old businesses, and the steam plant was down there. But it sailed into the Maumee River in 1913. And then it's come back several times. Maybe some of you got to see it. And it's really fun to watch them navigate up there in the rigging and everything. Well, the British then retreated up into Canada. And here's Fort Meigs, Fort Stephenson, the Battle of Lake Erie, Put-in Bay. The British then, once they lost the fleet, was gone. And so the land forces had to retreat back up. Here's Frenchtown, Detroit, and back up into here, a town called the Thames, the Battle of the Thames. It was, well, on the Thames River, not in London, but in Ontario. And right here at that battle and Navarre was there, that's where Tecumseh was killed. And once he was killed, the Native American forces just scattered. American victory, and Proctor just was retreated back and he was gone. And so here we are speaking American English. America has moved west, the Northwest Territories, and now, of course, all the way across the continent. And Peter played a role in that, he was a Toledoan. And one of the first ones was Peter Navarre. So that's where Tecumseh was killed there at the Battle of the Thames. And Navarre told some tall tales later on as he got older, and these historians would come and talk to him. He'd tell some tall stories, and so he claimed he's the one that killed Tecumseh, because there were a bunch of shots fired at him, you know, and no. And Robin did a lot of the research on that, and no, it was probably a guy named Johnston from Kentucky, colonel that actually fired the shot. But anyway, that's where Tecumseh was killed, and that pretty much ended all the fighting. Tecumseh was an amazing, amazing leader. Well, after the war, I'm going to go real quickly now, pick up speed with Navarre's life. He just basically stayed out in the woods, trapped, shot muskrat. I guess they were the tastiest. I don't know. Lived in the woods. His life. And he had 3 wives. Yeah, yeah, there you see him. It's probably because he was so good looking. But the first one was Catherine Suzor, 1815. Well, she died right after they were married in childbirth, within the first year, 1815. 10 years later, he marries Robert was his last name, her last name, 1825, Genevieve Robert, and she also dies in childbirth. And here's 1825, now he's up in 40s. He, around 40 anyway, and no kids and no wife. And he's out there in a cabin in the woods. And then in 1828, he marries Catherine Bordeaux, and that was the charm. Had 8 kids. And for the Navarres, that wasn't many. Yeah, Patrick was here telling me he's a direct descendant of Robert, the older brother. And Robert had 15 kids. But Peter had 8, and they just, were out there and living in the woods. And then later in his life, these historians now, this is kind of around the Civil War and after, putting together American history and talking about the War of 1812. And so they come and start interviewing Peter. And he tells them all this stuff. And they don't know. But you got Lossing here in 1860, you've got Lyman Draper here in 1863 and a couple times. You got all these guys that are writing about the history of this area, interviewing Peter Navarre. So in 1870, they invite him to the Oliver House. They had a big dinner. 1870, it was only 11 years old at that time. Have you been to the Oliver House, Maumee Bay Brewery? And that's one of the oldest buildings, 1859 in Toledo. And so Navarre was there, and they had a big dinner for these guys, and they're just talking about our history, and people are getting more and more interested. Then in June of 1871, they have a big reunion of the soldiers from the War of 1812, like a 60th reunion from the War of 1812 soldiers, and they meet up in Monroe, Michigan. Well, here we are. All these guys fought in the War of 1812. Right here, first row left, there's Peter. And then some others that you might remember, this is Custer's father, and up at the top, there's Custer, George Armstrong Custer. They're in Monroe, Michigan. And this would be like 5 years before the Little Bighorn. And then Robert was there as well. Robert and Peter both served as scouts. And then the other brothers, Francois, Alexis, and James, they just trappers. So this reunion, we got an actual picture of Peter Navarre, 1871. He died 3 years later. He was buried out of St. Louis Church in East Toledo. Oops. He died right there in East Toledo, kind of the foot of the Cherry Street Bridge in 1874, March 20th, 1874. So here this would be Main Street, right, taken from Front Street in East Toledo, looking towards the bridge. This would be probably in the 1890s or something, but there was a hotel right here on the corner where McDonald's is now, if you know the east side. And there's a hotel there. And he was brought in just a few weeks, really, before he died. Spent a whole life just out in the cabins. Just a few weeks before he died, came in and died there in that hotel. He was buried out of St. Louis Parish in East Toledo, which was only 3 or 4 years old at that time in 1874. But St. Louis was the French Catholic parish on the east side. They put up a stone. He was taken to Mount Carmel Cemetery, which supposedly was a big procession at the time. He was very well known when he died. Went to Mount Carmel, but they didn't put a stone up until 1923. So if you go to Mount Carmel Cemetery, you'll see this stone, and it says Peter Navarre was buried 400 feet from here. 400 feet must be south. And so we there marched it off, and sure enough, you get this little grave which says Peter Navarre, Monard's Company, Michigan Militia, War of 1812. Well, Peter was never an official soldier. And so he had a big problem trying to get his pension. And he didn't get a pension until about 1864 during the Civil War. And that really helped him in his old age out there in the woods. Well, remembering Peter Navarre, there's the Machen painting of him from 1867 when he was actually posing for the painting. So in East Toledo, which is where he's so well known, we have Navarre Avenue. Here you see Navarre Avenue now. You're looking, you're going under the viaduct there by Sun Oil, be on your right now. You go under the viaduct and you're looking out towards Wheeling. You can actually see the tower of the old Metzger's Market there, corner of Navarre and Wheeling. And that's what Navarre Avenue looked like. Well, there's the viaduct today. It's still there. That iron foundation of it, still there. This is the first picture is about 1903. And so Navarre Avenue, as you get further out, it's called Jerusalem Road, but Navarre Avenue is kind of the main thoroughfare still. It's the main shopping area in Oregon today. Navarre School, which I went to, and this would be looking north on Kingston, and if you can see it, here at the right, you're looking across Navarre Avenue to the first Navarre School, which stood, it's a parking lot now. When I was at Navarre, they used to have a little ball diamond we played in there across Navarre Avenue, and that was the first Navarre School. Then this was the second one, 1920 that was built. It was there for about 85 years, and then about 2005, 2006, the new Navarre School opened right on that same spot, and it's still Navarre School. So we got Navarre Avenue, Navarre School, and we got Navarre Park. It was one of the oldest parks in Toledo. It was purchased by the city about 1892 or 3. It's a ravine kind of hilly area, if you know where Navarre Park is. And of course, Peter Navarre would have walked through there many times and trapped, and so it was named after, of course, Peter Navarre. There's the first shelter house at Navarre Park, where the current one is. That was built in 1895 and was kind of an open air thing. There's the current shelter house, Navarre Park, which is now the East Toledo Senior Center. And that was built by the WPA about 1938-39. And then in 2007, we decided to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the Navarres coming to East Toledo, settle in what became East Toledo in 1807. So we got a plaque or a marker from the state. Peter Navarre, Robin was the one that really did that and got the marker. And we're all gathered there, looking very formal. And but yeah, just proud of that. Yeah, the good-looking ones right in front. And then Robin also started a tradition of having a Peter Navarre Day for the kids of Navarre School at Navarre Park. And Robin and the teachers bring the whole school down. This is an amazing thing. We'd see these kids all parading down there and into the park. And we'd talk to them. Robin had events planned. And there's Terry, my friend Terry Braymeyer, a classmate of mine from Wade. He's talking to the kids. He's a descendant of Robert Navarre, dresses up. And we tell these kids about, what was it like 200 years ago in East Toledo? Where could you drive a car? Were there any streets? Where'd you get your food? Do you like muskrat? What if you got sick? Were there any schools? And we're telling these kids what it was like to live in a cabin in the woods and have to trap and shoot your supper. And these kids, were making them aware of the history, you see, and the whole school. And it's just a wonderful thing. And we did that for years. There's Terry. There's Peter. There's Dr. Durant, looking a little embarrassed. He's standing there with us, I guess. By the way, Dr. Durant is just amazing, how much he loves TPS. So he came to, I think, more than one of the Peter Navarre days, probably. I know he'd come to things like that. And then, of course, the Navarre Monument is there at Navarre Park. That was put there July 4th, 1914. So it's been there a long time. It's been cleaned up at different times. I think most years Robin puts a wreath over there, and we remember Peter Navarre. Well, there he is, talking to some of the kids. And kids, you're talking to these kids about Peter Navarre, and if you're dressed up or something, they'll say, well, how old are you? And I'd say, well, 217. And they look at me like, yeah, that's about right. Love these kids, And then finally, the Navarre Cabin. The Navarre Cabin was out, this is the latest cabin, like I said, out Corduroy Road, out past Big Ditch, Stadium Road. And it was just a wooden cabin. This is Maumee Town, which is out there at Stadium and Corduroy. An old crossroads little town, they called it. Well, Peter Navarre probably shopped at this store because his cabin was right down from there. And this is a picture from 1870. And then they built a later store, of course. But he could have, that's what it looked like to him. And then the cabin in 1922, 100 years ago, on September 9th, was brought from out there into Navarre Park. That's why it was named Peter Navarre Day, an official holiday in the city of Toledo, September 9th. And so we try to do our Navarre things around September 9th. And so that's why we said tomorrow. It's the 100th anniversary of moving that cabin. This is the oldest picture we have of it. Mrs. Larson from Navarre School, one of my teachers, gave me this picture. It was this Ruby Hammond, the young girl, she knew her when she was older. And so there's a picture down there in front of the cabin. You just see the tops of some houses over here on Navarre Avenue. It's down near where the tennis courts are, on a little hill down there in Navarre Park. Later on, it got kind of vandalized. These women would go down there and do stuff. And then pose for pictures. But they even put a fence around it, and it was still kids would break in there, and they're afraid they would be like starting fires and stuff. and it got all overgrown. And so in 1957, it was taken out of Navarre Park, and do you know where it went? The zoo, yep. And I don't have a picture of it at the zoo. If anybody does, let me know. It was right outside the amphitheater as you walk through that main way through the zoo. But it sat there then from 1957 for almost 20 years till 1976. And a Trilby Historical Society raised money to move it to what was then Crosby Gardens. Why they did it, I have no idea, but it was their bicentennial project. And so there it is out at Toledo Botanical Gardens. And it looks just the same. You still have the initials carved. If you walk around, you see the initials carved in the side and everything. And of course, we'd like it back on the east side, but they keep it pretty well guarded out there. Yeah. And there's Peter with all his friends. Called it the harem. There's Terry Braymeyer. That's over at Navarre Park. By the marker there we have at Navarre Park. Here are Navarre descendants. We had a big reunion in 2007, and dozens and dozens, I don't know how many descendants came back from all over. And like I say, there was 1 million Navarres. Robert had 15 kids, Peter 8, all the brothers. And there are literally hundreds and maybe thousands, probably thousands of descendants of Peter. So this was out at Pearson Park, and people were posed out there, a talk we were doing, and it just happened to be Easter time. And so I don't know what the rabbit symbolizes with the Navarres. I have no idea. These are Navarres and Kellers out on Bayshore Road in the late 1800s. And Cleo Keller here on the left, he was a photographer. A lot of the early pictures we have around Toledo from the 1890s were Cleo Keller pictures. And they all lived out there on the Bayshore Road, those families. And some of the Navarres were in that group. Here you see, let's see, this would be Jenny Navarre, I think here. This is Gabriella, they called her Gay, and she married Guy Houck, so it was Guy and Gay, and Jenny. And the Navarres just lived out there on Bayshore for generations. Here you see them going to a party. This was the old Alexis Navarre home. It was originally a cabin. This is Otter Creek, and Alexis was one of the 5 brothers and built this cabin, and then he built a bigger house later on. So that'd be Alexis Navarre's house. Here you see this kind of faded drawing of it, but this would be, Alexis was gone by this time. I'm guessing maybe 1880s, maybe, well, 70s maybe. But Elizabeth Navarre, it's hard to see in this picture, but Elizabeth, his wife, was still there. Their daughter, which I think was Elizabeth too, I may be wrong on the wife's name, and she married Cad Williams, who fought in the Civil War. And the Cad Williams Civil War sword came down to us. We donated to the Oregon Jerusalem Historical Society. So here they are in front of the house, 1870s, 1880s, and there it sat. And then later on, they moved it over onto Bayshore Road, and there's the house. This is Alexis Navarre's house. It's on Bayshore Road near where Wynn dead ends into there, across from the Edison plant out there. Helen Lang was the one that told me a lot of this stuff. She was a member of Hope Lutheran, and she's a granddaughter of Cad and Elizabeth Navarre. I used to call on her, and she would just tell me all this stuff. Some of the things that have come down through the family, Navarre items. And so we're trying to keep the memory of Peter Navarre alive, to teach the kids what it was like, to remember the history of Toledo, Northwest Ohio, and the whole area, and the importance of what happened here. You saw us there. There was a little incident we had there in the park. What's that? Yeah, we were Eastsiders, so yeah, you know how that is. And it was kind of funny. Terry and Mike Navarre, who was the police chief at that time, direct descendant of Peter. Mike's now the sheriff of Oregon. But Mike just loves his family history and is very proud of that. So he let us off. And remembering, like I said, our heritage. And I just point out, this is Marshall Lloyd. He's a professor. I'm not sure where he is now. He was over in Baltimore somewhere. He's down south now. And Marshall has a database of, if you're a Navarre descendant and you can give him your grandfather or grandmother, he can take you back to those 5 brothers. Thousands of Navarres. If you're doing your family research, Marshall Lloyd, and of course Robin played such an important role in all of these things we did. The Oregon Jerusalem Historical Society, is part of the base of it. This little Branville school has the whole Toledo military collection. The Civil War collection, when they closed the Veterans Hall down by the courthouse, they took all that stuff to the zoo, put it in the basement of the museum. It was getting water damaged or walking away, and Oregon Jerusalem took that on. And they're open on Thursdays, like 1 to 4, 12 to 4, something. And it's all packed in there. They've done a wonderful job preserving our history. And of course, the Oregon Jerusalem Historical Society, Oregon, what is now Oregon, but originally it was the township. East Toledo was Oregon Township before it was part of Toledo. So it's all overlapping. So we're keeping this history alive. And so is the East Toledo Historical Society as well. So thank you very much for coming tonight. There he is, our hero. Thank you. And I'm just going to announce, can I do it now, Ryan? Yeah, the next TPS program of this series, next lecture, is Architecture of Toledo and the remarkable 419, which we are, by Ted Long, who's a great historian and a really good guy. October 6th at 7 o'clock at Start High School. If you're interested in the architecture, it'll be a great program. Can I ask for questions?
Yeah, I was just going to close it up, so go right ahead.
Okay, does anybody have a question or anything you want to add? Yes.
During the war in 1812, wasn't there a period where there was no summer? No summer, the year of no summer?
That was the Revolutionary War, wasn't it? When Washington was at Valley Forge? Oh, the harvest? Might be. I'm not sure. I've never heard it applied to the War of 1812. But or 1812. Yeah, I don't know. The Navarres, you have to realize that they went through some hard times when you're living off the land like that. We had out at Pearson Park, we did a lantern tour for the 75th anniversary of Pearson Park. And so one of the things was Terry and I were out there in the woods at Pearson, dressed up like the Navarre brothers, and it gets dark. You can't see anything. You got this little fire going here, and you just realize they traveled for days all around checking their traps, and that's where they slept at night. And there were snakes and critters, and that was their life. And they didn't have to worry about the harvest, but, it was a hard life, right? So be thankful when you go home and turn on the football game or something. Just be thankful.
Help yourself, that's absolutely great. So thank you again for coming tonight. Please join us next month. We will be having another one then in November, and that will be at Woodward High School, and that will be Lou Haybear, Day by Day in Toledo. So we're trying to hit different topics. The last thing before we let you go, if you have a specific topic that you would like to learn more about, please feel free to speak with me after. We've already got this year's book, but we're looking for the future, so we'd absolutely love to hear what you have to say. So thanks again so much for coming tonight. Thank you, Larry.
Oh, yeah, Ryan. I'll go down if anybody wants to ask me anything.
Thank you.
Okay. I take this down.
Yep,
You can get that.
I'll get that.